Hello, I'm H.R. McMaster. In 1989, I was a captain in the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, headquartered in Nuremberg. Our regiment patrolled a stretch of the Iron Curtain along 375 kilometers of the West German-East German border and 365 kilometers along the West German-Czechoslovak border. That November, the Berlin Wall fell and the Iron Curtain parted. Throngs of East Germans flooded across the border, bearing bouquets of flowers and bottles of wine to give to the scouts of Eagle Troop. There were hugs and tears of joy. The United States and the free world had triumphed over communist totalitarianism without firing a shot. The Soviet Union broke apart. Just over a year later, those same cavalry troopers attacked into Iraq and helped kick Saddam Hussein's army out of Kuwait. In a 23-minute assault, Eagle Troop destroyed a brigade of Iraq's Republican Guard in one lopsided victory in a war that was full of lopsided victories. In retrospect, those successes marked the end of an era. American leaders across both political parties were confident, but overconfidence led to complacency. Many forgot that the United States had to compete in foreign affairs and embraced three flawed assumptions about the emerging post-Cold War era. First, some believed that an arc of history guaranteed the primacy of free and open societies over authoritarian and closed societies. The expansion of liberal democracy was inevitable. Second, some assumed that the old rules of international relations and competition were now irrelevant. Global governance and a great power condominium would displace rivalry. Third, some asserted that America's unmatched prowess would guarantee full spectrum dominance over any potential enemy. Military competition was over. All three assumptions were false. From Vladimir Putin in Russia to the Kim family regime in North Korea, autocracy is alive and well. Jihadist groups from Al-Qaeda to the Islamic State have bypassed America's superiority in conventional warfare and engaged in asymmetric warfare. And a new great power competition emerged as Chinese Communist Party leaders spoke the language of cooperation while conducting one of the greatest peacetime military buildups in history, suppressing freedom at home, exporting its authoritarian model, and undermining international organizations and the rules-based international order. Those flawed assumptions stemmed from what we might call strategic narcissism, the tendency to define problems as we would like them to be. Strategic narcissism encourages the conceit that others have no aspirations or agency except in reaction to U.S. policies and actions. It generates policies and strategies based on what the purveyor prefers rather than what the situation demands. Today, strategic narcissism fosters a sentiment among many in both political parties that after long and costly wars, U.S. disengagement from overseas challenges would be an unmitigated good. The excessive optimism of the 1990s shifted to extreme pessimism due to the financial crisis of 2008 and the unanticipated length and cost of wars in Afghanistan and across the Middle East. Pessimism generated a bias toward resignation and an associated tendency to view retrenchment as the best way to reduce costs and advance American interests. For example, the Trump administration portrayed recent decisions to withdraw small contingents of U.S. forces that are enabling Afghan and Iraqi forces to bear the brunt of the fight against jihadist terrorists as protecting rather than jeopardizing hard-won military gains. Those decisions overlooked the lesson of the Obama administration's complete withdrawal from Iraq in December 2011. U.S. disengagement created for the massive Islamic State offensive in 2014, which eventually allowed the most destructive terrorist organization in history to control territory the size of Britain. Although the Trump administration was right to demand that NATO allies do more to share the burden of collective defense, reducing U.S. forces in Europe appears unwise at a time when Putin's principal rival was recently poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent, and the Kremlin threatens to quash calls for freedom in Belarus. The most adamant advocates of disengagement are archetypes of strategic narcissism. They believe that the United States is the principal cause of the world's problems. Our presence abroad, they argue, creates enemies. Our absence would restore harmony. The United States, therefore, is to blame for antagonizing Russia and China. America, they believe, causes jihadist terrorism because U.S. presence in predominantly Muslim countries generates a natural backlash. The United States drives nuclear proliferation, they argue, because states like Iran and North Korea need those weapons to defend against an aggressive United States. But the historical record makes clear that American behavior did not cause Russian and Chinese aggression, jihadist terrorism, or the hostility of Iran and North Korea. Disengagement would not solve any of those challenges. Despite the ahistorical nature of their argument, calls for American withdrawal are bound to gain adherence as the nation emerges from the triple crises associated with the pandemic, economic repression, and social unrest sparked by the murder of George Floyd. There is an alternative: sensible and sustained engagement. The COVID-19 experience reinforces a fundamental lesson of the September 11th, 2001 mass murders. Threats that originate abroad, if not checked, can move rapidly across our world. Once they penetrate our shores, the cost to the American people can prove difficult to bear. Moreover, it is much cheaper to deter Russia and China with strong alliances and forward-positioned American forces than it would be to bear the costs of a catastrophic war triggered by Kremlin or Chinese Communist Party aggression. Sensible and sustained engagement is not just a job for the government. Jim Hake's Spirit of America is an organization dedicated to extend American influence abroad through goodwill in a quiet, effective, and sustained manner. The balance of power has been shifting against the United States and other free and open societies. Much of that shift has been self-inflicted. Strategic narcissism has impelled over-optimistic policies that underappreciated the risks and costs of action, as well as pessimistic policies that underestimated the risks and costs of inaction. All of us can play a role in improving our strategic competence. I have been privileged to work with 3 superb think tanks committed to bridging ideas and research into action to build a future of peace, prosperity, and freedom: the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, the Hudson Institute, and the Hoover Institution. It is indeed past time to restore America's strategic competence based on a clear understanding of crucial challenges to American security and what the historian Zachary Shore terms strategic empathy, the recognition that others exercise influence and authorship over our collective future. Empathy displaces narcissism with an appreciation of the emotions, aspirations, and ideologies that drive and constrain the other, particularly rivals, adversaries, and enemies. Educating the public about the battlegrounds of today and tomorrow is an especially important task. A reinvigoration of history in higher level education is particularly important, as social science theories tend to mask the complex causality of events and obscure the cultural, psychological, social, and economic elements that distinguish cases from one another. Some theories risk sapping students of strategic empathy and encouraging them to reduce complex problem sets into frameworks that create only the illusion of understanding. A growing interest in applied history in some universities is a promising development. Finally, we might all resolve to improve not only our competence, but also the confidence necessary to implement a sustained approach to foreign policy and national security. George Floyd's murder and the protests and violence it sparked in the midst of a pandemic laid bare deep divisions in our society. Those divisions have sapped confidence in our common identity as Americans. A lack of empathy for one another is catalyzing a destructive combination of identity politics, vitriolic partisan rhetoric, bigotry, and racism. Lack of empathy is rooted in ignorance. Those who know least about issues and who are strangers to their fellow Americans seek affirmation of their biases rather than knowledge. They judge their neighbors rather than try to understand their perspectives. History can play a role here as well. We might reinforce the worn fabric of our society by considering how our past produced our present. Divisions in our society and civil unrest associated with them are not new. A broad historical perspective leads us to the conclusion that we are still coping with the legacy of slavery. As bias and vitriol contaminates the information environment today, the manipulation of history remains an important tool for those who want to sow division and conflict rather than foster unity and goodwill. Ignorance of history, compounded by the abuse of history, undermines our ability to work together and improve our nation and our society because it saps our national pride. As the late philosopher Richard Rorty observed, national pride is to countries what self-respect is to individuals, a necessary condition for self-improvement. Pride in our nation should not derive from a contrived, happy view of history, but rather from a recognition that the American experiment in freedom and democracy always was and remains a work in progress. For example, the emancipation of 4 million people after the most destructive war in our history was only the beginning of a long journey for equal rights. Milestones along that journey included the failure of Reconstruction after the Civil War, Jim Crow segregation and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and separate but equal. In the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement dismantled the legal basis for Jim Crow segregation, but cultural, economic, educational, and other forms of disenfranchisement continued. The manipulation of history was foundational to the obstruction of equal rights for Black Americans as the myth of the lost cause portrayed slavery as benign instead of cruel, and the Civil War as a noble effort to preserve states' rights rather than slavery. But it is also an abuse of history to cast the American Revolution as an effort to preserve slavery rather than a righteous struggle to found a nation on principles that ultimately rendered that horrible institution unsustainable. It is possible to celebrate the principles enshrined in our Declaration of Independence and Bill of Rights, and also recognize that much of our history has cut against those principles, and that work remains to realize them. We are fortunate that we can make progress because our republic was founded on the radical idea that sovereignty lies neither with king nor parliament, but with the people. With just over a month to go before the November elections, we might ask candidates for office to give us their answers to the following questions, while also considering what we might do ourselves. How to rebuild trust in American institutions at the national and local levels, with an emphasis on police reform, police community relations, and the rule of law. How to rekindle hope among rural and urban communities that have lost sight of the American dream by improving education, abolishing the soft bigotry of low expectations, strengthening families, and fostering new economic opportunity. How to urge our representatives in government to set an example for bipartisanship and address fundamental causes of polarization in America. How to inspire more Americans to serve in organizations that bring people together from all racial, economic, ethnic, religious, and other backgrounds, such that, as happens routinely in our military, Prejudice gives way to common understanding, mutual trust, and pride in serving the nation and one another. How to improve civic education. Pride in the vision of our founders and the uniqueness of our democracy, while recognizing, as our founders did, that the American experiment requires constant nurturing and improvement. And of course, as we began, how to develop a reasoned and sustainable foreign policy to secure freedom, achieve peace, and promote prosperity for generations to come. As we discuss all of the above, we should give at least equal time to what we agree upon before we clarify areas of disagreement. For example, we all might agree that it is right to express outrage over the murder of George Floyd and police brutality directed against minorities, and also agree that it is wrong to use peaceful protests as a cover for destructive violence and criminality. While we should be concerned about the polarization of our society, we should remain confident in our principles and who we are as a people. I serve on the board of the Smith Richardson Foundation, an organization that has for decades promoted strategic competence and confidence through its funding. There is a dire need for others who work in this domain, and we can all make a difference every day. Reach out to our fellow Americans. Engage in respectful debate. Reject demagoguery rooted in ignorance, bigotry, and racism, and strengthen our democracy. As the civil rights activist and patriot Rosa Parks observed, to bring about change, you must not be afraid to take the first step. We will fail when we fail to try. Thank you for what you will do to build strategic competence, grow our confidence, and create a better future for generations to come.
Well, good afternoon. I think we're ready to begin. I appreciate you and thank you for joining our breakout session, Battlegrounds, Defending Democracy Through Principled Foreign Policy. My name is Marcus Ruzek. I'm Senior Program Director at the Marcus Foundation. The Marcus Foundation is the private philanthropic foundation of Bernie Marcus, co-founder of the Home Depot. I'm not going to read through the illustrious bios of our panelists today, but I do very much encourage all of you to take a look at these impressive gentlemen that are included on the panel today. But briefly, I'd like to mention each of them, and then we'll go into our first question. We have on the panel today Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, former National Security Advisor to President Trump and author of his new book, Battlegrounds, highly recommended. We also have Jim Hake, founder and CEO of Spirit of America. Spirit of America was a recent cover story on the Philanthropy magazine in their spring edition. We also have Mark Dubowitz, CEO of Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And what he wanted me to include about him is that he is personally sanctioned by Iran and very proud of it. So for those watching, to better understand who our panelists are and what it is that they care deeply about, I believe we must begin our discussion with the events of September 11th, 2001. That day, terrorists hijacked 4 airplanes and attacked our country, starting the global war on terrorism. I was a high school student on that September day, and it forever changed my life. I enlisted in the Army as soon as legally possible, and in 2004, when the Army saw fit to send me to college and become an officer, I was concerned that I might miss the war. Laughable now, as it may seem, I did not miss my portion of this 19-year war. I served as a Special Forces officer, led men in combat in Afghanistan fighting the Taliban, and more recently in northern Iraq fighting ISIS alongside our Kurdish Peshmerga. At the Marcus Foundation, September 11, 2001, has inspired Bernie Marcus, our chairman, to focus his philanthropy on caring for our war veterans and preventing the next 9/11 through organizations like Spirit of America and FDD. So my first question I'd like each of our panelists to address today is, how did 9/11 change the world? And specifically, how has it led you to the work you're currently doing today? General McMaster, great if you would start.
Sure. Well, hey, thanks. I've served in the Army for 34 years after graduating from West Point in 1984. I got to see some really big shifts in geopolitics and in our security and threats to our security. I was patrolling the border of East and West Germany in 1989 when the wall fell, which was a great triumph, obviously. And and led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and what we thought was the triumph of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. And I believe that led to a period of complacency in the area of national security and a belief that our military prowess could prevent the kind of devastating attacks that we witnessed on 9/11. And what I think 9/11, I think, drove home are a few elements of our security today that are very important to the philanthropic community and to the work that Jim Hake is doing and the work that Mark Dubowitz is doing. And that is that our enemies are determined to bypass what they consider our strengths, right? There are two ways to fight: asymmetrically and stupidly. I think Saddam Hussein in 91 picked stupidly, but our enemies today are trying to attack us where they see vulnerabilities, whether it's using box cutters and airplanes to commit the most devastating terrorist attack in history, or if it's to engage in a campaign of sustained political subversion against us, as we see Russia engaged in today. So I think for me, what it did is it broke me out as a military professional out of the mode of deterring a conventional foe, nuclear armed foe like the Soviet Union, and recognizing that there's a much larger range of threats with which we have to cope. Threats that come after us in a way that's physical, but also in new domains, space and cyberspace, but especially in the psychological and social and political dimension. And so that's the effect that it had on me. And then, of course, Marcus, like you, I've found myself spending many years abroad in Afghanistan and in Iraq as a result of 9/11.
Thank you, General McMaster. Mark, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me, and it's a real honor to be with these three gentlemen. I had a very different path. I was actually working in venture capital and high tech at the time 9/11 happened, and I was watching BBC, really infuriated by the anti-American programming, even in the days that followed 9/11. And my wife was coming down the stairs one night, and she saw me throw my shoe at the television set, and she said, "Okay, Mark, well, either you're going to have to, seek some professional help, or you're going to have to change careers." So we moved to Washington. We were living in Toronto at the time. I actually tried to enlist in the U.S. military. They wouldn't have me because I didn't have a green card. And I think they were being polite because I think I was just too old. Unfortunately, I didn't know HR at the time. Otherwise, I would have used HR to get into the military. But instead, I joined FDD. FDD was a startup think tank or action tank. And it was an opportunity to do to our enemies what our enemies had done to us and proceeded to do to us, which is with real focus and forbearance and an obsession. Our enemies went after us. They went after our weaknesses. And FDD was set up with the same objective: to do damage to the enemies of America in a focused and obsessive way. And for 17 years at FDD, I've had the real honor of being able to work with tremendous people like HR and Jim and Marcus and the Marcus Foundation to do damage to those enemies in defense of American freedom.
Thank you, Mark. Jim?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. So when the attacks of 9/11 occurred, I was an entrepreneur, a business person who I'd spent most of my career in Silicon Valley. I started one of the early internet media companies and sold that. I was working on an internet software company at the time. And I understood the attacks of 9/11 to be attacks on America, the idea of America, and the idea of a free society. And while I didn't have any military or government experience or background at all, I held and still do a very deep belief that the ideas that America stands for are the best ideas the world has going for it. Imperfect though we may be at living up to them from time to time, that those are the best ideas. And I wanted my children to grow up in a free society. So, I've often wondered, well, where did that connection to America's ideals come from? And I'm not exactly sure, but, like General McMaster, I grew up in Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, you take pride in anything you can take pride in. And one of those things is we are the birthplace of our great nation. And on the staircase, on the stairway from our downstairs up to the bedrooms, we had a copy of the Declaration of Independence that I walked by at least twice a day, every day, and over 20 years. And so when the attacks occurred, I just committed myself that I am going to do something to help. I'm going to do something to help our great nation prevail over these challenges. And that led to a lot of investigation, because as I said, I had no military or government experience at all. And it took a while to figure out what the right idea was.
Yeah. No, that's great. I really appreciate the three of you really explaining kind of your path to what's led you today. Going a little bit deeper on this big issue of national security, foreign policy, it seems quite daunting from a philanthropic standpoint. The DoD's 2021 budget is over $700 billion. State Department, $40 billion. My question for all of you is why? Why should philanthropy invest in national security and foreign policy? There's so much money there already. Have at it, whoever wants to go first.
Hey, I'll start first, because then I think maybe I'll just lay the context, and then Jim and Mark can talk more. Marcus here. I mean, I don't think it would come as a surprise to anybody who's here today that the U.S. government is not particularly agile, right? and when opportunities arise to protect our country more effectively, to go after the weaknesses of our enemy, which are many. To clarify what America is about, our ideals, and as Jim said, our example to the world, to counter the disinformation and propaganda of our enemies, and to do it not only with words but with deeds. I think that we really do need the private sector to step in, and we need organizations like yours, like all three of yours, to fill these gaps that exist oftentimes by design, because of congressional oversight of the executive branch and the inability really for the executive branch to do what it needs to do, but really are just consistent with relative competitive advantages between a private sector and a non-governmental organization and the government itself. And my personal experience, both with Foundation for Defense of Democracy and Spirit of America, is that they fill those gaps brilliantly. I mean, for Jim, I was on the receiving end of Jim's assistance in both Iraq and in Afghanistan, that filled really critical niches that gave us just enough of an advantage, I think, to make the difference in critical competitions with the enemies of all civilized people I think, in Afghanistan, what is a modern day frontier between barbarism and civilization. And I think the power of FDD is in large measure that the research that they do, the great work that they do on teeing up sanctions and financial actions, and pulling the curtain back on the illicit flows through terrorist and insurgent networks, for example, of or Iranian proxy forces, of people, money, weapons, narcotics, and so forth. That you can use that, and I did use that as a consumer of that tremendous work and analysis over the years, even in the job of, especially maybe in the job of National Security Advisor. So I think that there are just gaps associated mainly with competitive advantages that these organizations have, especially when they're under inspired leadership, like the leaders who are here today.
Well, HR makes a great framing for it. And so I think philanthropists understand that there are gaps in education and a role for private philanthropy. They understand that there are gaps in healthcare and a role for private philanthropy. In fact, the Marcus Foundation and Bernie Marcus, with setting up the CDC Foundation to fill gaps in what the Centers for Disease Control is, an awesome example. Where it's unfamiliar, but which is true, is that there are gaps in the national security domain as well. And so as far as the why those gaps exist, well, you would never say, let's find the biggest, most complex problem we possibly can, where we have adversaries coming after us who are adaptive and fast and unrestrained in the ways that a democratic society like ours are constrained. And then say, well, here's the best we can do to prevail against those guys. We're going to hand it over to our biggest bureaucracies, and we're going to stand back and watch what happens. Right? You would never, ever say that. Now, the challenge for philanthropists is, until, at least in Spirit of America's domain, even if you wanted to do something, you couldn't until relatively recently. It literally took an act of Congress and an agreement between our organization, the Department of Defense, to make the things that we'll be talking about today and some of the examples even possible. So why should philanthropists care about the gaps in national security? They should care because they want their children and grandchildren to grow up in a free society. And that is literally what's at stake. That's why I love the title of HR's book, which is it's a fight to defend the free world. And that sounds maybe dramatic and an exaggeration. It is not.
Yeah, I mean, certainly agree with all of that. I would say, as the only person here who wasn't born in the United States, I was born in South Africa. I grew up in Canada, lived for a number of years in places like Israel and France. What's really struck me about the United States, which is just truly remarkable, is the openness of the American political and policy system to non-governmental organizations. I mean, you don't find that anywhere in the world, where think tanks and advocacy groups actually have the ability to really influence government policy. In fact, they have a constitutional right to do so. And what it does mean is that you, as Jim said, you have an opportunity to work with these government agencies. Many of them are filled with great professionals, great patriots, who are every single day drinking from a fire hose with information that is flooding them, mostly on the classified side. They also have huge responsibilities. They are also, as HR said, subject to enormous oversight. And what they really need, and often what they don't have the time to do, is come up with good policy ideas and have those policy ideas backed by actionable and objective and credible research. And so that's where organizations like FDD and others, policy institutes, think tanks, can really play a role in Washington in working with all of these different agencies. And by the way, working agencies against other agencies. I mean, that's sort of the way our American system works, right? If you don't like who's in the White House, well, that's what work with Congress. If you don't like who the Senate Majority Leader is, well, that's a great opportunity to work with the House leadership. If you think the Treasury Department is slow rolling economic warfare against the Islamic Republic of Iran, well, call the State Department and get the folks over there to weigh in with Treasury. So being able to work the interagency from the outside is often more effective than even people on the inside, I think, as HR knows, where the interagency sometimes can be stymied and sometimes can be broken.
I appreciate
Can I say one other thing on this, because it's a really good question that anyone with us today should be asking. And why can't government do it all? And as I said, you would never hand over our biggest problem and say let government deal with it, and that's good enough for America. But the other thing is the same limitations exist in large institutions, no matter who they are, not just our government and military. My favorite example is the Silicon Valley one, which is in 1998, Microsoft had 23,000 employees, $14 billion in cash. They had made it through all the antitrust stuff. They could do whatever they wanted. And that year, Google was started with 2 guys and $200,000 checks. So why couldn't Microsoft be Google? Because it's just not the way it works. You can't have an institution that operates on a global scale and innovate at the lowest level at the same time. It's never happened in business. It can't happen in national security.
Hey, Marcus, I'll just say quickly, I think, two ways to think about it is, as Jim is just talking about, is you fill gaps that exist in our capabilities, and you also catalyze a change. And I think that those are 2 very important functions for organizations like FDD and Spirit of America.
That's so great to hear. I really appreciate all of you weighing in on it. I want to dig in a little bit more focused on some of the policy for just a moment. I want to remind everybody viewing, please use the chat function at the bottom to ask any questions you'd like answered. We're going to use the back portion of this time to answer your questions, and I've already seen several come in. So, but before we go there, in line with HR's discussion on strategic confidence that many of you heard in the TED style talk, what are some of the major positions or camps in today's discussion? We kind of heard you talk about restrainers and retainers with respect to all the many different viewpoints of how America can handle and be strategically confident and competent. I'd love to, General McMaster, maybe you start and then and hear Jim and Mark also talk about this.
Well, I think there are those today who are pessimistic based on really this movement, I think, in the 2000s toward retrenchment, especially after the financial crisis, the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're pessimistic about really our ability to affect positive change internationally in a way that advances our security, our prosperity, and our influence in the world. And I think, Marcus, it's magnified today as we face really the triple crises of the pandemic, the recession, and the social divisions in our society associated with George Floyd's murder, the issues of race and inequality of opportunity, and now the vitriolic partisan environment that we're in, as the election approaches. So I think there is a tendency toward introspection these days, and an associated neglect of these crucial challenges that we're facing internationally. But sadly, those crucial challenges aren't going away. And in fact, many of them have been catalyzed or accelerated based on the COVID-19 crisis and the perception of our adversaries that this might be either a period of opportunity in the case of China, or maybe a period of a bit of period of desperation on the part of Vladimir Putin, for example. I could give others, but it's a crucial time, as you already alluded to, Marcus, in the question, because there is so much momentum behind disengaging, which I think could be disastrous for us. We should just know from COVID-19 that once a threat that develops overseas reaches your shores, you can cope with that threat really only at an exorbitant price. So I think that the organizations that we're discussing today, yours, I think are very important, not only for what they do, but also for the case they make to the American people and how they help educate Americans about these crucial challenges, because ultimately, obviously, we'll get the foreign policy that the American people want. And I think we have an opportunity through education to ask the American people to demand a more effective foreign policy.
Thanks.
Yeah, and if I could jump in, Marcus, I think that's exactly right. I mean, one thing that the restrainers or the isolationists today fail to explain properly is who comes next, right? After World War II, an exhausted British Empire handed over the baton of global leadership to the United States, and thank God, because we then enjoyed decades of prosperity and peace as the United States patrolled the seas and guaranteed really the survival of the liberal order. Well, what happens when the United States goes away? Who do we hand the baton to? The European Union? I mean, the European Union has shown some, remarkable success in terms of generating prosperity. But I don't think there's anybody on this Zoom call, or really anybody out there, who believes the EU can take on the mantle of global leadership. Who's waiting in the wings? As HR said, China, Russia, and certainly their allies like Iran and perhaps Erdogan's Islamist Turkey. So the United States has to retain that mantle of leadership. And the isolationists today are no different than the isolationists of the 1930s, of Charles Lindbergh's America First Committee, right? Who understandably, in some respects, after World War I, were advocating for America to go home, right, after the devastation of World War I, thinking that the totalitarians in Europe would leave us alone. And clearly the 30s and 40s showed that wasn't indeed the case. In the Cold War, Vietnam, post-Vietnam, again, people wanted to go home, rebuild America, and there was a strong isolationist push. Well, after Iraq and Afghanistan and the wars of 9/11, the same kind of sentiment. But isolationists and restrainers, again, are going to help inadvertently embolden the worst authoritarians out there.
So I'll two things. One, just on, I'm not a real policy person. I'll just say that my policy is to help America win. But that doesn't really answer your question, Marcus. And I understand why people are discouraged and want to, look away and so forth. I mean, the last 19 years have given anybody plenty to disagree with, no matter who you are. And, mixed results, poor results, things that are discouraging. I think the biggest thing, and this goes back to, I'll say, a mistake by President Bush after 9/11, is, for the most part, people don't have a way to do anything. They don't have a way to help. And if you can't help, you are, by definition, you're helpless. And if you're helpless, you become hopeless in a heartbeat. And one of the things we've seen with Spirit of America, we don't talk about, as an organization, the really high level issues usually that are going on in the world. And we had one supporter or potential supporters said, yeah, this mess in Iraq, I don't want to have anything to do with it. I said, okay, that's fine. But we have a special forces team that is saying metal detectors are needed for Peshmerga partner forces, and it's going to help save our guys' lives and limbs. He goes, I'm in. And so through that, a person is connected. When you start to, and this is the kind of thing that America is good at. You can take action, you can do things and see what works and build from there. But what we're not good at is being helpless. And we're in fact, we're really bad at being helpless. And I would say, most of that is good. And the point here is that, for philanthropy, we're not helpless. There are meaningful things we can do that are going to affect the outcome. And if we don't do those things, we're going to fail.
Thank you, Jim. Mark, I really appreciate that. I want to drill down a little bit deeper on this specifically. I mean, when we're talking about specific foreign policy and national security issues, items, things that an everyday American cares about potentially, but doesn't know how to do anything about it. We've got an audience of foundations and philanthropists. I'd like to ask first, Mark, can you give us some examples, as a philanthropist, as a foundation, how do we measure some return on investment here? Where's the ROI in investing in an organization like FDD to be able to make your voice heard? And then Jim, we'll go to you after Mark, and then General McMaster, I'd love to hear your perspective after they've talked, as far as both being the consumer of that, as high as the NSA, as well as a general officer in the Army.
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. It's interesting. You asked that question about the State Department and the Defense Department having a combined $60 billion budget. And then obviously our intelligence community and our Treasury Department. I mean, we have a huge government. And you would say, why would anyone care about FDD? And what was interesting is last August, despite the fact that the United States and Iran were locking horns, the Islamic Republic decided to go after a think tank, a 65-person think tank called FDD, called us economic terrorists, sanctioned us, said, quote unquote, we're the designing and implementing arm of the US government on Iran policy, end of quote, and threatened us. And we've obviously spent a lot of time bolstering our security as a result. I consider that, in some respects, a badge of honor. In some respects, I have responsibility as CEO of FDD, obviously, to make sure that my folks are safe. But I think what it speaks to is the Islamic Republic of Iran's recognition of what FDD has done over 17 years of work in waging an economic warfare campaign against the Islamic Republic that has cost Iran hundreds of billions of dollars. And we say to our investors, we do damage to the enemies of America, including but not limited to Iran. And we do that through forensic research. We do that through actionable open source intelligence. We do that through working with policymakers in order to take ideas into action, action into results, results into damage to those enemies. And if I was smart, I would have created a fundraising model from the beginning where instead of taking tax deductible donations, I would have merely asked for 1 cent on every dollar of damage that we had caused to America's enemies. I think that would have been a more lucrative fundraising model, but unfortunately wasn't smart enough to do that. So I think we've demonstrated over the course of the past decade and a half that you can do serious damage to the enemies, and those enemies understand the damage you cause. They obviously hit you back, they fight back. But in some respects, that's no better demonstration of what Jim and HR have been saying, and that is that private philanthropy and private organizations who are nimble and entrepreneurial and understand return on investment can cause more damage sometimes than even the US government. And I would just end with this, we send a return on investment report every June and one every December. And we say to our investors, if you're not happy with the damage we've caused, if we've overpromised and underdelivered, we'll send you your money back, because we're not a charity, we're a business. Jim and I both come from business backgrounds, from VC, from high tech. And folks work really hard for their money. We don't deserve that money unless we're generating real and measurable results every year.
Yeah, Marcus, I love the ROI question. And as Mark is saying, we're both business people, and in business, ROI is easy to measure. It's hard to achieve, but it's easy to measure. It's more difficult in the nonprofit sphere. But but in business, if you don't produce results, you're dead. If as an entrepreneur, if you confuse motion with progress, you're dead. So, looking for Spirit of America, I have to explain a little bit about what we do to have these examples make sense. So we're a privately funded citizen service organization. We have an all veteran field operations team that works alongside, embedded with U.S. military personnel, special forces, work with U.S. ambassadors, State Department personnel all over the world. We've done several thousand projects over 17 years now in about 81 different countries. So I'll give you a couple. I mentioned the bomb detectors for partner forces in Iraq and Syria. The ROI there is they find hundreds of roadside bombs, lives and limbs are saved. That's a pretty easy and simple one. An example also in the height of the fight against the Islamic State, there was a U.S. Special Forces team, 12 Special Forces soldiers who were partnered with about 1,000 Peshmerga soldiers. And ISIS was trying to take Kirkuk, which is in northern Iraq. And the Peshmerga were suffering heavy casualties. And one of the reasons was that they were bleeding out on the battlefield. And so this Special Forces Master Sergeant said, we need tourniquets for the Peshmerga, and we need to give them GPS devices so that they can precisely identify their position. So when we bring in air support, we're not bombing them. So, and this is maybe, it's going to sound unbelievable to the folks here, but we spent about $6,500 to buy several hundred tourniquets and about 50 GPS devices, got them there in about a week. And what happened was the Peshmerga started, their survival rates went way up, which started to build more confidence in their fighting ability. And then with the GPS devices, they could say, precisely where they were, so the U.S. could bring in air support and take care of the Islamic State. So for $6,500, this Master Sergeant credited this support with helping to turn the tide of that battle and prevent the subjugation of 1 million people in Kirkuk and the lives and limbs of partner forces. Another quick example is in West Africa, in Niger. U.S. Special Operations Team said, we need Spirit of America's help to prevent war here. We have Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb coming in from Mali. We have Boko Haram coming up from Nigeria. We have the Islamic State coming down from Libya. And they're trying to destabilize the country and bring the tribes onto their side to fight the government. And so what we did there was put together a package of assistance that was most meaningful to the key tribes and the tribal leaders, involving livestock health. Livestock health in Niger is more important than human health, because human health derives from it. And we set up a scholarship program where tribal youth could get a veterinary education and then go back and meet the needs of their tribes. So all these things helped influence these tribes that, okay, the better future is in this direction with our own government and with the Americans than it is with the terrorist groups. So those are, so in that case, and still knock on wood, there's not been an outbreak of war in Niger. So in our case, we look at, we have great flexibility. We only support the objectives of U.S. personnel, what our troops and diplomats say is needed. We're not a freelance do-good organization around the world. And so the objectives that they have are our objectives, and we can only measure our return on investment based on meeting their objectives and helping them, keep safe and be successful.
Hey, Marcus, I just highlight just make 2 points here. First of all, there is one less tangible, I think, benefit of these kinds of activities and efforts that are undertaken by FDD and by Spirit of America, and that is, it helps connect American citizens to those who are fighting and serving in their name, and I think that's intrinsically important in terms of Americans being aware that we are in a competition that will determine the degree to which our world will remain free, safe, and prosperous. And the second point that I would make is that the educational aspect of this, by getting more people involved in efforts like Jim's or FDD's work on financial actions, or on the daily contest and competition in cyberspace, or the Center for Military and Political Power, or emerging technologies. Education is immensely important to winning the competition, because these competitions now span well beyond diplomacy and military efforts. And for example, the Chinese Communist Party, an effort that I was just involved in, was to expose the People's Liberation Army's infiltration of our research activities, government funded and university and corporate research activities with the intention of extracting sensitive technologies and intellectual property and applying them to the buildup of the People's Liberation Army to gain a differential advantage over our armed forces. And so if these competitions are not confined anymore, to the public sector, and our innovation models are quite different as well. We're much more reliant on the private sector for technologies that will help us maintain our competitive advantages militarily, but also economically. And the more Americans are aware of the nature of this competition, the better we can be at defending ourselves from these very pernicious campaigns, such as that of the Chinese Communist Party under the Made in China 2025 initiative, for example, or the overarching construct of military-civil fusion.
Marcus, there's two other things on the ROI question that I would encourage people to look at. And this is a very sophisticated, the roundtable has very sophisticated folks, so this may go without saying, but one is to look at, is whatever is being done, is it demand driven or is it supply driven? And what I've seen, in the nonprofit world is there, and this is noble in a lot of ways, is there is a lot of supply driven activity because people want to do the good things they want to do. And I don't have any problem with that, of course, but I think where you get the best return on investment is when there is, just as in business, if there's a real demand for what's being done, and a demand not in the words of the nonprofit, but in the words of those who they serve. That's one thing. The second thing is to look at, is there leverage in this activity? And I would say in both FDD's and Spirit of America's case, there's a lot of leverage. In our case, it's because what we do is built upon let's put it this way: the infrastructure for what we do, our national security apparatus, our troops and our diplomats, they are bought and paid for already. They are there. And so we're layered on top of that. So every private dollar is building on the massive investment that's already made. And so for us to do the things either in Iraq or anywhere else, or the West Africa example, where we spent I think $70,000 for the livestock health assistance in Niger, it would have been at least $1 million more. Well, we never would have done it because we only did it because the U.S. military was there. But there's great leverage in that. And so looking at demand for what's being done, that it's demand driven, and leverage, I think, is essential as ingredients to the ROI question.
I appreciate that. And I just want to say, this is unique. Myself as a veteran, specifically in Northern Iraq, leading a team of Green Berets, I actually was a beneficiary of Spirit of America's support. I am one of those veterans potentially that has his life and limb because of the metal detectors that you guys were able to provide. I'll tell you from the warfighter's perspective, of course, government money could have bought, metal detectors and gotten them to our partner force. But the bureaucratic process with which to do so was so difficult. In my 180-day tour there, by the time, if I submitted on day one the request for funding, likely those metal detectors would not have arrived until the next rotation came in. The fact that Spirit of America can be entrepreneurial, can move in quickly, is truly amazing. And I have to add on to that, in a rotation in Afghanistan, also being a recipient from FDD, I can't even tell you how many times I have turned to the Long War Journal, which is a publication they keep on the conflict in Afghanistan, and found information, totally open source, that helped shape the battlefield better for actual troops on the ground. And so I want to go to you, Mark, quickly, kind of on that point. Long War Journal is one of many things that you guys do. Being able to provide that kind of information and becoming a target like you've talked about. One of our listeners has actually asked a question directly for you. Your organizations receive threats from the Iranian regime. Are your donors confused? Are your donors concerned about that? What do you think about that from your donors' perspective? And specifically, how do you guys handle it? You talked about physical security, but maybe a layer deeper.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So we obviously have taken it very seriously, physical security, travel security, but particularly cyber and informational security. We've encouraged our donors to support us through donor advised funds in order to give them kind of a double layer of anonymity. And we've also had our security folks working closely with them or with their own security folks if they've got them, to ensure that they're safe and they're protected. So, we take it very seriously. We've had to obviously raise a considerable amount of money for our security fund in order to bring on a head of security, in order to pay cyber firms. And around the world, whenever we travel, we're usually traveling with security. I had police officers outside my house 24/7 for about 8 months, and we only recently had to let them go because we built a safe room in place of that, because it just got prohibitively expensive. So certainly take it very, very seriously. To your point on kind of why do our adversaries hate us, and why do some of our allies, that Marcus, thank you for the shout out on the Long War Journal, find us useful? I think it's because, again, we really appreciate the power of credible information and open source information that you as a special forces officer in Afghanistan can access. Obviously, as HR can tell you, a lot of this information is in the classified world. A lot of limitations on how that information can be used, even by people with security clearances, interagency. There's a lot of limitations on how you can use that information with your allies around the world. So any policymaker really desperately needs open source information that's deep and forensic and detailed and credible to be able to share that information across the US government and around the world. And so the Long War Journal and many of our other publications really proceed with that in mind. And I want to just pick up on a point Jim said, because I love what he said about, it's not about supply driven, it's demand driven. It's funny because that's exactly what we say about our research. Too many think tanks in Washington write papers, write monographs, great reports, and put them out there hoping somebody would read them. And unfortunately, in our information age, a lot of them just collect dust. We set up in 2011 an on-demand research arm of FDD, where we respond to research requests from policymakers, government officials, journalists, for information that they want, not information we think they should be reading. And we process thousands of those requests every year. In fact, I think we're on track for about 6,000 requests this year. And that if they're asking for that information, they're going to use that information. And if they use it, there's a much greater chance you can actually turn that into action and into policy, and therefore into results. So on demand, I think, Jim, you and I, because we grew up in the private sector, we understand, it's about your customer. It's about your stakeholders. It's about what they need. You could build the best mousetrap, but if that's not going to satisfy or meet a market demand, you're not going to sell too many mousetraps. So you got to build those mousetraps with your customers in mind so that they can use them and operationalize them to achieve the purposes that they need.
Yeah, it's a really profound point. And while, as I mentioned, after 9/11, I had never had any military or government background. That turned out to be a gift in a couple of ways. One is the sort of obvious one, which is I didn't know what couldn't be done. So, we were operating for, 15 years before we ultimately got congressional approval and the agreement with the DOD. That was one thing. That wasn't the most important. Because I didn't know, because I didn't think I was an expert in what needed to be done, I had no illusion about it. So I built in a listening to the folks on the ground, military, civilian, DOD, State Department, to what they said. And the connection back to my background as an entrepreneur was, and also as an investor is, across every sector of society, we get the best results when we support the initiative of people closest to the problem. And that's what we do. And it works. It doesn't work every time, everywhere, but overall, it's given us the most dynamic economy in the history of the world. It's given us the prosperity and security that we enjoy today. So for us to apply that, it's Spirit of America to apply that entrepreneurial approach to national security, it's not too surprising that it works there. It's just, it's unfamiliar.
Yeah, and Marcus, if I could just pick up on one thing, because, if you listen to Jim and me, it sounds like we got everything figured out. And we had to figure it out from day one. And the truth is, I think, as Jim would probably tell you, as a startup guy, as an investor, often what you're doing is you're zigging and zagging, right? I mean, and that's the beauty of American entrepreneurship. It's the beauty of Silicon Valley, where HR is sitting right now, is that ability to identify a problem, throw some resources at it, realize you got it wrong, and then zag, and then go in a different direction. And then go off in that direction, achieve some real measurable results, and then hit a wall and zig. And it's really running organizations. And I know this is how Jim runs his organization, by zigging and zagging and really understanding that things change and it's a fluid process and things change rapidly. And I think in the US government, getting back to that initial question, as HR could probably tell you, it's a lot harder to move the US government. And the US government is, it's like an ocean liner, than it is to move Spirit of America or FDD as smaller organizations. So we're able to zig and zag much more quickly, and then hopefully help our friends in the US government identify opportunities where they can zig and zag, even though it's going to take them a little bit more time.
Yeah, and it's a great combination because it's the same thing with the example of one is you couldn't do it. It's not better. One's not better than the other. You need both. It's part of a healthy ecosystem in this regard. And just to look at Silicon Valley, for example, the most commodity of anything is cash. And yet you look at the different ways that in our own economy, we put cash to work. The Bank of America, let's say, is a lot more like the US government, a lot more restrictions on funding, a lot more regulations about what can be done. And you would never say, well, why do we need Sand Hill Road? Why do we need the venture capital community in our economy? Well, it'd be laughable if anybody ever said that, because you need different skill sets. You need the ability to operate on a big scale with lots of oversight and regulations. And you need the ability to zig and zag, as Mark said, and innovate at a lower level. And that's where the private and public piece that we're both talking about is the best formula for the country and a best formula for these national security issues we're talking about.
Yeah. I appreciate you guys answering these questions. Now I'm going to pivot. We've gotten several questions from our audience, so I want to pivot and direct some of these questions to you. First, we'll start with one for General McMaster. Pretty simple. How can the everyday person who might not be an expert in foreign policy help defend democracy? I think it's a great question. I'd love for you to start us off with it.
Yeah, I think it's supporting the best analysis and development of products that help us understand better the nature of the threats to our security and our prosperity, and then can bridge ideas into policies and actions. And that's going to be across the think tank community, for example, and to support the best ones. I think what's really important to make just a point in addition to what Mark and Jim just talked about is that the information, the analysis, the technologies that we used to need for our security used to be developed in closed, classified systems and organizations, right? Think about how Silicon Valley got its start, right? Big government research projects that developed technologies that had military application and then were spun out into the civilian sector. That innovation model is now flipped. And in fact, the technologies that are important to our security, important to our prosperity, are developed in the private sector. And so it's very important for us to defend those technologies and that knowledge base. And then of course, information is available in much different ways now. We can learn so much more about our enemies and adversaries from social media skimming or commercial satellites, such as those that Planet Labs put up into orbit. And then we can have analytical products that are in many ways much more insightful and comprehensive than those we can get from our intelligence agencies. So I think in many ways, the best analysis, the best recommendations come from the very high quality think tanks. And then the second part of this answer, I guess I would just say what I mentioned before is that if we are going to put into place a more rational and effective foreign policy in the long term, we need the American people to be educated. The greatest strength of our nation, I think, is an educated populace. So I think that's another dimension of support that's needed, so that we understand these crucial challenges to our security, and then we can come together to work together to determine what we have to do to overcome those challenges.
Sir, I appreciate that. And I think that it actually is a perfect segue, what you just said, into our another question from our audience. What role can philanthropy play in helping to educate the public about the importance of sound foreign policy and national security? Are there initiatives that have been particularly effective in this regard? So I think that's bait for all three. So whoever wants to start, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think as HR said, and Jim has also alluded to, I mean, a lot of these things, can come out of a startup environment. These ideas, at FDD, for example, we have a phenomenal woman, Samantha Ravitch, who was Deputy National Security Advisor, the Bush administration, and she's been very active with the intelligence community. And as HR knows, Samantha is one of the experts in cyber. We talked about the COVID-19 threat, but can you imagine if we were all experiencing this pandemic and we didn't have electricity because China, Iran, Russia had attacked the electrical grid? We were all sitting in the dark or in the cold. So Samantha actually created a center at FDD called the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation. And Sam is not just putting out great research papers and ideas, but she's actually working very closely with the US government and the private sector on ways to strengthen the grid, harden the electrical grid, figuring out ways to help the Pentagon secure its supply chain. The Pentagon's probably got one of the largest supply chains in the world. Samantha did a partnership with Microsoft and brought blockchain technology in order to secure the distinct parts of the Pentagon supply chain and prove to them that this could be done using advanced technology. This is something the Pentagon wasn't even on top of. So, our cyber lab, our Center on Military and Political Power, our Center on Economic Financial Power. We also have a program. We've trained 500 military vets and people who work in national security on fellowships. We take them on trips like to Israel so they can see another democracy under attack by the same enemies. We take them to the Far East. We take them to the Gulf. So these are opportunities where private philanthropy has been able to launch new centers, attack new problems, find new solutions, and train the best and the brightest of the next generation. I'll just conclude with this. I have to say again, as somebody who didn't get to serve in the military, even though I tried, and didn't grow up in America, some of the best and brightest in this country are people who went through the US military. And not only the best and the brightest, but people who are intensely patriotic. And so, like Jim, I've been really proud and honored to be able to meet these people, work with these people, help educate these people, and have these people educate me and my team. And that's where you really start to believe again in America and the American promise.
So, the education point is a really good one. I'm going to take it a slightly different direction in that, and this is for people who are out of school, which is the majority of the population. So the media and information environment is so crowded. Keeping someone's attention on something about information for longer than 15 minutes seems just about impossible. And so I think the thing, and this again is maybe the counterintuitive part, is to get people educated, you have to give them something to do, some way to directly participate so that they are interested. And it changes, if you can do that, people move from disinterested spectator to participant. They're in the game. And then you start to be interested in, well, what's really happening? Because you're involved. You're not being helpless and hopeless any longer. So that is one of the key dimensions of what we do. We don't tell people, hey, we're educating you about something, but by their involvement in the things that we do, they are getting educated. They're getting connected to the importance of doing things in a way which is impactful and understandable. That's one thing. The second is, and what I'm about to mention is not on our website, but Marcus, as you know, we're working on it, is a domestic initiative specifically focused on the threat of the Chinese Communist Party, raising awareness of that threat and mobilizing Americans to take action about that. So if whoever asked the question is interested in talking about that, however they might reach me, I'd be happy to chat about it. But the way to get people educated is to combine the action piece. And without that, people can be super aware of the problem and just want to bang their head against the wall, which is, in my case, it's okay, but it's counterproductive.
Hey, I would just give a few examples. Well, first of all, I think you can go to FDD's website and you see products that are immensely useful in terms of education, but also policy implementation. And then I'll just give examples of a few projects that I've been involved with at the Hoover Institution here at Stanford, which I think is a good spot to educate because you have so many young people here, and I think it's our younger generation that we ought to try to reach more in a couple of ways to educate about our crucial challenges to security, but also in connection with what they can do about it and how they can restore really confidence in who we are as a people through civics education and understanding the great virtues of our democracy as well. So in the midst of the pandemic, I was working with with an organization called the U.S. Civilian Corps that was trying to to match people to the need of the pandemic, in advance, people with the right skill sets, respiratory therapists, those who could help organize the biomedical response and so forth. And in so doing, we were identifying a lot of best practices, that, and we were sharing those on Zoom in a particular forum. And I thought, well, we can't let this go to waste. We're learning so much. So I asked for volunteers among the student body and my research assistants here at Hoover. 11 students volunteered. And yesterday we published a report that's based on interviews with those at critical spots in response to this pandemic. Many of them were policy people and were people on the Hill, staffers who were writing legislation about biomedical response. And so they were in on it to begin with. And we rolled it out yesterday, and I know it's going to inform policy. We created an archive here of those oral histories, so those who are looking at pandemic response in a more detailed way going forward can do so as well. And then the other aspects of this is that at FDD as well, as I mentioned, this is a private sector competition, and I've been able to make connections between private sector companies that really need an assessment. Hey, what is the threat to my company, of Chinese industrial espionage, for example? And FDD is very well equipped to do that in a very practical way. At Hoover, I would give you another example of the China Global Sharp Power Initiative. So, I mean, whoever asked the question, I'd be happy to have a follow-on conversation with you about how to evaluate these programs. What are the best ones? Of course, we have two of the greatest organizations to support here because they deliver. But I think there are some extraordinary efforts ongoing that could be scaled up. I think it's also important to take a look at the production of the products that are used to communicate to the relevant audiences. And a best practice I would highlight here would be at Hoover, the Policy Ed series at Hoover is quite powerful. It's succinct. I think it reaches a wide audience. And then another think tank that we all know and love, and Mark, I mean, we don't compete with each other. We collaborate with each other across these think tanks, is a small but mighty think tank called the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which develops curricula for schools, especially in the area of civics education. And so there are so many examples out here. You have two of the best ones, but I'm happy to provide more in the area of education in particular.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, we're getting a little bit short on time, so we got to almost every question that came in. But I want to take just the last few minutes we've got. I'd like to give each of you a minute to tell us and tell our audience, what reason do you have for optimism, right? There's a whole lot of reason to be cynical right now. We're in the middle of what's a pretty nasty election. Turn the news on. When I do see the international world, I see North Korea and China and Iran and many other threats out there. What gives you reason to be optimistic today?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I'm actually coming to you all from Tel Aviv. It's 11:30 at night, and it's a good place to be optimistic, believe it or not. And it's also a place where you can really see the importance and indispensability of American power. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the recent normalization agreements between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain. Right? There's a normalization wave that is really crashing over the Middle East, and it's bringing peace. It's bringing more stability, and that would not have happened without the United States. And I know that because I worked very closely with both the Emiratis and the Israelis on this normalization agreement. I worked closely with the ambassador Yusuf Al-Taiba, who's the UAE ambassador to Washington, to actually conceptualize this idea of normalization and work with Yusuf on a strategy to actually make it happen. I won't go into all the details of this. If you're interested, please let me know. But one of the important recommendations I made to Yusuf as he was struggling to figure out how could he normalize while the Israelis were moving forward with annexation is I said, look, Yusuf, the way to do this is create a win-win-win for your boss, Mohammed bin Zayed in Abu Dhabi, for President Trump in Washington, and for Prime Minister Netanyahu in Jerusalem. And what was that? It was to involve the Americans, believe it. Go to the White House, bring in Jared Kushner, bring in that team, and demonstrate that normalization can be a win-win-win for all three leaders. And I was really honored to be in Washington a couple of weeks ago on the South Lawn for the signing ceremony. It gives you a lot of hope and a lot of optimism, after decades of enmity here. of what President Trump has called blood in the sand, you're now seeing this incredible optimism. And I'm witnessing it here, both in the private sector and in the public sector. I've now been on Zoom calls for the past week and a half with Israeli venture capital firms and UAE investors and high-tech companies, and they just can't wait to embrace each other and start doing business together. So for me, it's a reason for hope. And again, what other country is going to bring the United States, what other country is going to bring Israel and its erstwhile enemies together but the United States? Again, that's why we need retainers. That's why we need American leadership. And that's why American isolationism is only going to lead to more destabilization, more conflict, more crises.
I'll go next.
Go ahead, Jim.
So I'm both very worried and very optimistic. The optimism is in that we are still the United States of America. We are still the land of the free and the home of the brave. And it's really good to remember our roots. So America was started by a bunch of citizens. It wasn't started by a king. The United States of America was started by citizens. And if we can start up a country and get to where we are, when we mobilize our citizens, we can do anything. One of the problems is that we face this threat from the Chinese Communist Party. And if we don't deal with that threat, our children will not grow up in a free society. Another problem is, the awareness of that threat is low, and the awareness of any action that people can take is even lower. So that sounds bad, but it's actually an opportunity that I'm optimistic about, because once we start to get the American people in the game and that awareness grows and people start to engage and take action, the Chinese Communist Party is not going to know what to do, because a centralized approach, an authoritarian approach like that, doesn't know how to deal with the kind of entrepreneurial activity that we can bring to bear in support of U.S. efforts abroad and taking action at home. And so that is, we are at less than a 0.1% of getting the American people engaged in dealing with that problem. Now, it means we have to do it for there to be actual optimism, but I am confident that we'll do it. And the trick is we need to do it enough time so the water that the CCP is turning up doesn't get too hot for us to be able to jump out of the pot and really deal with them.
Hey, Marcus, I'll say that I'm optimistic for 3 reasons. And first, to add to what Mark said, I'm confident in humanity. I have confidence in humanity. And I love the name of these accords, the Abraham Accords, because it reminds us all that, we're all people of the book. And I think what this accord has done is it has isolated jihadist terrorists from sources of strength and support, and particularly ideological support. Really, this was United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, but it all began, I think, in Saudi Arabia, when everybody was scratching their head like, why the heck is Donald Trump going to Riyadh? The reason was to give that speech alongside King Salman that meant to pivot Saudi Arabia away from proselytizing a warped version of religion, a perverted interpretation of religion that justified hatred, and then used that hatred for violence, to mobilize violence and inspire violence against innocent people. So I think the Abraham Accords are important in that connection, and also important because it really crystallized what the real threat to security and stability in the region is. And that's this sectarian civil war that is fomented by jihadist terrorists, but by Iran, who's been fighting a proxy war against us for 4 decades. And nobody's done more to, I think, expose the nature of that threat, who the real enemies are, and what the opportunities are for humanity than Mark Dubowitz and FDD. Also, nobody has done more to clarify our intentions and to highlight our common humanity, despite cultural and religious differences, than Spirit of America. And so I'm confident because I'm confident in humanity, and I'm confident because I've seen the payoff of the work of FDD and Spirit of America firsthand, either at the policy level, at the highest levels in Washington, or on the ground in places like Iraq and in Afghanistan. I'm confident for a second reason, with what Jim talked about. I'm confident in our democratic principles and institutions and processes, and in our ability to restore our confidence in those democratic principles and institutions and processes. And even as we have this self-doubt and lack of confidence these days, we should celebrate. We should celebrate it as Jim said, we're not a monarchy, right? We fought a revolution over this radical idea that sovereignty lies with the people, and we all have a say in how we're governed. And in terms of boosting our confidence, I think we ought to recognize, there aren't too many people trying to immigrate into communist China. And the great strength of our nation is represented here today by Mark Dubowitz. I mean, if people like Mark come to our country and strengthen our country. And so that ought to be a reason for confidence as well. And the third reason is just the fact that we're here at this forum. We're here where those of you who have come here today are willing to give to strengthen our democracy, to improve our security, and to do it with a spirit of entrepreneurialism in a way that accentuates our competitive advantages. And we do have tremendous competitive advantages. I think they're represented by the idea that all of us can contribute to our security, our prosperity, and our influence in the world. And I hope the discussion today highlighted ways in which that is possible with three really, Marcus, with your organization, with three stellar organizations. And it's just been a privilege to be part of the conversation. Thanks.
I'm grateful for all of you gentlemen. Thank you very much. The only thing I'll add is I'm grateful, if I can answer my own question, I'm grateful that we have an all volunteer military. And after 19 years of war, we still have volunteers lining up at those recruiting stations. And so I'm the first one to bash on the millennial generation, but I want to note the millennials have sustained the longest conflict in our nation's history, and that should be known. So